Hi all, our instructive game today will be flattening the sandcastle. To demonstrate this theme, I'll choose the game Judit Polgar against Alexander Morozevich, played in the Wijk of Corus 2000. So playing white, Judit Polgar plays e4, and we see a French defence from Morozevich. So after knight c3 we see the classical variation, inviting white to close the centre. Polgar however plays the aggressive bishop g5. And now we see d takes e4 being played, and after knight takes e4, bishop e7. Now Morozevich is actually inviting a sharp dynamic line, because after bishop takes f6 he doesn't recapture with his bishop. Instead he plays g takes f6, and the scene is set for a ferocious attacking game. The g file will be used later by black to launch a vicious attack on white's king. After knight f3, a6 is played, and with this move there's a few strategic and aggressive intentions. b5 will mean that c4 is a little bit discouraged from white, and it will allow bishop b7, where this bishop will challenge the later fianchetto bishop of the white king position. So g3, b5, and now bishop g2, so the white fianchettos, and it seems to be a cosy and safe fortress here, but is it a sandcastle? That is the question. Bishop b7, and after queen e2, Morozevich doesn't routinely castle, he first plays knight d7. Now white castles, and now black castles. So potentially Morozevich can move his king and then play rook g8 to intensify the g-file pressure. But it looks as though white has a very solid fortress at the moment. How on earth will Morozevich weaken this fortress? We'll see. Rook ad1 and now bishop d5. One of the ideas of this move is to later be able to play c6. And the bishop will be outside of that pawn chain and not, for example, behind that measly c6 pawn. So by doing that, Morozevich will be offering that bishop continually to this fianchetto bishop. Once that fianchetto bishop is exchanged, white will have more weaknesses around the king. Rook fe1 and now king h8. So preparing potentially rook g8 now. After knight fd2, Morozevich plays c6. So he's really establishing that bishop on d5 and saying to white, play c4, and I don't mind these isolated pawns, because after b takes c4, black has now isolated c and a pawns. However, knight takes c4 and a5, and black has potential opportunities now of queen b8, increasing the pressure on the b file as well. So this could be a useful preliminary to a g file attack which could occur later. After knight c3, white is now threatening in some variations. Bishop takes d5, and later knight takes d5 if black's not as careful because of this bishop on e7 and this virtual pin on the e pawn. So Morozevich first strengthens his position. He plays rook e8 to try to protect that bishop on e7. So now after knight e3 he can afford the luxury of playing f5. So with f5 the bishop can come to f6 to guard his dark squares a bit on his own king. Knight c4 and queen b8 was played now. So potentially the queen's quite aggressive coming to b4. White has no dark square bishop, so this is quite a threat. After knight a4, queen b4, white is forced to play a passive move on the queen side, b3. And now Morozevich finally does something about this bishop. He moves it to f6. So not only is he now able to do this, but it's also attacking d4 a little bit. So if the rook later comes to g8 to g4, there'll be a tempo gain on this pawn, as we'll see. So queen c2, rook g8. Potentially black is threatening also f4, but white would gain control of the e4 square, so f4 has to be very well timed. After queen c1, rook g4 was played. So this is the tempo gain, which I earlier mentioned. So white has to do something about this. White ends up playing knight e5 to protect that d pawn. But after knight takes e5, d takes e5, Morozevich plays bishop e7, and he has a very fine looking position here. He's got the potential now to play rook g8, doubling his rooks. But white's king still looks like a solid fortress. Where is the sandcastle? We're about to see. After rook d3, rook ag8, Judit now plays rook ed1. So now Morozevich starts to soften that sandcastle with the first wave of attack, using a pawn to slightly weaken white's king. f4 is played. Now Judit plays queen c3, and after fg, hg, Morozevich launches the second wave of attack against the sandcastle. He plays now the highly aggressive h5, and it's at this point Judit now swaps off her fianchetto bishop. Perhaps this is a bad mistake and she should have done something else, like trade off queens here. But she plays bishop takes d5 here, and now her king's starting to look quite weak. After c takes d5, rook f3, instead of a routine move like rook g7, which might allow white to play king g2 and rook h1, Morozevich instead protects this f7 pawn with king g7. So there still affords possibilities of h4, and even rook h8 is introduced as a new resource. So this is a very clever attacking and defensive move, king g7. So queen c7 was played now, and now h4, and white's king is looking decidedly weak at the moment, especially after that bishop was exchanged for this bishop on d5. So king g2, h takes g, and now Rybka actually assesses this as totally critical for white. Black is actually winning this position by force. After f takes g3, queen e4. This pin introduces an enormous threat into the position of rook takes g3 check. For example, say white protected the e2 square by playing rook d2 here. Then there would follow rook takes g3 check, king takes, and now king f8, and this is actually mating in 6 moves. For example, king f2, bishop h4 check, king f1, queen takes f3, mating after rook f2, queen takes f2. So this shows that white is in severe trouble now after this queen e4. White's king has been exposed to be a sandcastle and not so solid after all. So queen c3 was played, and now queen e2 check, king h3, and with the black queen covering this second rank, Morozevich, all he needs to do is play rook h8, but if he did so immediately, then king takes g4. So first he just plays simply rook g5. So now threatening the ominous rook h8. And actually it's a forced mate in 5 in this position. So Judit Polgar resigned here. Her king was just smashed to bits in this game. Let's have a look in overview and summary at how this occurred again. So the French defence was played, and it was the classical variation with bishop g5. So after d takes e4, knight takes e4, Morozevich chose the sharp bishop e7, accepting double pawns after bishop takes f6, g takes f6. Now after knight f3 he played a6, so already he has intentions of opposing this fianchetto bishop on the diagonal with a later b5 and bishop b7, and perhaps bishop d5 already is his plan. So we see now the fianchetto bishop was challenged, and black playing bishop d5 now, to be followed later by c6. So black not worrying about these isolated pawns and using the b-file pressure as a preliminary to get back white a bit passive on the queen side before launching the attack later on the king side. So after knight c4 queen b8, knight a4 queen b4, and now we see the doubling of black's rooks on the g-file. So knight takes e5, d takes, bishop e7, rook d3, rook ag8. So the doubling has now occurred. So black is now going to soften the white king with a later f4 and even h4 later. So white hastened to the end though with this bishop takes d5 coming up. So the white king was looking weak already in this position. And after rook f3, the ingenious move king g7, combining attack with defence, was played. So this does leave the white king quite vulnerable in many variations, even if white had exchanged queens here. So queen c7 perhaps was a bit of a waste of time, because h4, and there's even more pressure on the white king, and the queen just ends up having to go back. After king g2, hg, hg, this powerful pin with queen e4 shows that this queen manoeuvre was also a very attacking manoeuvre in itself to b8, having relevance for the white king position. So after queen c3, queen e2 check, it was actually a crushing position now, and after king h3, rook g5, it's a forced mate in 5. So Morozevich showed how to soften the white king with waves of attack and using the G file doubling up rooks, and later an F4 and H4 was used to really show the weaknesses of the white king position. I hope you enjoyed that. Please leave any comments on YouTube. Thanks very much.